Okay, so welcome to Nature by the Sea. My name is Orla Prendergast. I teach on the Outdoor Education degree course in GMIT in Castlebar. And today we're out at Old Head Beach out near Lewisburg, so on the Wild Atlantic Way and on the shores of Clew Bay. So we're going to be looking at some of the seaweeds that live out here that cling onto the rocks, some of the animals that live in the rock pools. So there's huge amounts of variety of life out here. So it's a great place to look at nature, have fun, lots of variety, lots of things to learn, and a great place to bring your family, friends, children that you work with. So there's, like I said, a huge variety of life out here, and we're going to be using a couple of sort of identification charts and booklets to help us figure out what's what. One is produced here by the Field Studies Council, okay, and it has all the sort of seaweeds that we might see, so we'll be using that, so that's a very good guide. And again, you can buy that. The Field Studies Council will have a website and you can purchase that. They publish lots of really good nature guides actually, okay? So we'll be using that. So that's just for the seaweeds. And they have another one which covers sort of the seaweeds and some of the animals. So these charts are great because even if you drop them into the rock pools or it's lashing rain, they don't disintegrate. So they're very child friendly. So they're great to have. And then if you want to sort of double check, get more detail, then there's two good Irish seashore guidebooks as well. This is a fairly new one here, Ireland's Seashore. Produced by Collins Press, so that's a great one to have, and it covers some of the fish, seaweeds, animals that you might see, so that's a great one. Plenty of really good photos and information about them. And then there's another one produced by Sherkin Island Marine Centre down in Cork, and again it covers all the common things that you might encounter, so they're great. You can put them in your rucksack and then you can give these out to your groups to work with. So Old Head, it's a great location. It's very safe, it's sheltered, it's tucked into the side of Clew Bay. So you don't have any big waves coming in here that might wash people off their feet. So that's really important. Pick somewhere that you know and you know is sheltered from the waves coming in. The other thing to think about is when is low tide, because you want to arrive when the tide is out so you can see as much as possible. So you can just check your local tide tables. I just, for today, checked, Westport tide tables. And low tide today is at 3 o'clock. So I planned then to arrive around 1 o'clock, and that means I have 2 hours to sort of explore before I know the tide's going to start coming back in, getting my feet wet, washing things away. So if you can arrive 2 hours before low tide. The other thing, if you have flexibility, is to try and come when you have the really low tides, the low tides, which are the spring tides, and they occur twice a month. A day before and after a full moon and a new moon, and that means you can see, say, the seaweeds like the kelps. They grow really far out, just beyond the low tide mark. So if you want to see them, you need to come at the spring tides. Yeah, so it's always worth doing a little bit of research just to make sure the place is safe that you're going to visit. There might be signs up, so just make sure you read them. There might be warning signs about dangerous currents or whatever. Talk to locals, local fishermen, give you good advice. Locals walking the beach. If there's lifeguards around, obviously chat to them. So it's always worth having a look on the beach to see what can be washed up. So there could be all sorts of animals, shells, seaweeds washed up on the beach. And actually this is a great example here. We have an egg case. It's called a mermaid's purse, and it's actually from a ray, which is like a flatfish. It's a member of the shark family. So the egg sort of hatches out in this, it gets attached to the seaweed. The egg can be in there for quite a long period of time before it hatches out. So they're absolutely beautiful. There's loads of different sort of species. There's skates, rays, catfish, cat sharks, dogfish would use this type of mermaid's purse to put their eggs in. Beautiful. Yeah, so that's great. Now we've got some Brent geese here down on the beach. So they're feeding on eelgrass, and they're winter visitors. They come to Ireland because it's too cold up in the sort of the Arctic tundra for them to live. So they come here for the winter and then they go back up north and lay their eggs and breed there for the summer and then come back every winter. So it's great to see them out there. So it's worth bringing a pair of binoculars as well, which is to the beach. There's things like oyster catchers as well that feed along the coast. So there's plenty of opportunity for bird watching as well as the seaweeds and the rock pools. Okay. Okay, so we're going to be looking at various sort of zones in the beach, from what we call here the splash zone. So the tide doesn't come up here, but lots of the waves might occasionally splash. So it's a very salty place to live. So we'll start here and then we're going to finish way down past the end of the pier behind us here at the low tide mark. So up here you have lichens growing. So this is a very common one, and it looks like the rock, but it's actually a black lichen. It's called black tar lichen, grown on the rock here, and that's a very common white one there as well. Other plants that you get in this splash zone would be sea pinks. So now we're in March, it doesn't look too pretty, but come summertime it has beautiful sort of pink flowers on it. So this is your splash zone, and then we're going to go and look at the next sort of set of seaweeds that grow below this. Okay, so we have been looking at the lichens over there, so they're in the splash zone. So the first seaweeds you're going to see are these little guys here. They're called channel rack. So they're very small, and they're only covered by water when the tide is fully in. So they might only be covered by the water for maybe an hour or two every day. And the thing about seaweeds is they can only make food, they can only grow when they're covered by water. So that's why these guys are so small, because they've only a chance of 1 or 2 hours per day. We're going from the smallest seaweed that we have on the beach here, which would be your channel rack, to the biggest, which is one of the kelps here. So this has got washed up after a storm. So kelps grow right down at the low tide mark. So they're rarely uncovered unless you have one of those super low tides, one of those spring tides. And they can get up to maybe 2 meters in length. Okay, so they attach themselves on, like old seaweeds have to attach themselves onto a rock. So when you're looking at a beach to go exploring, you want a rocky beach, because seaweeds need a foundation. So they have this like sucker feet, they're called holdfasts, that cling themselves on. So you can see all these seaweeds here have all these attachment points, but on occasion they get ripped off by a storm or whatever. And then I suppose a kelp is nearly like an oak tree, has mosses and lichens growing on it. And it's the same with this sort of kelp here. This is the main sort of stem, and it has lots of little extra red seaweeds growing on top of it. And then you have the main fronds. They're all sort of in strips here. Okay, because it's, I suppose, less resistance to the waves. So don't get washed off the rocks because there's less resistance. And growing on the fronds is actually another animal. So this is called a sea mat. So that's like a really sort of simple organism. There's loads of little cells there, and they filter the water through their bodies. So you have an animal living on the kelp. And let's see, is there anything else living on the kelp here? Yeah. Okay, there's another guy. So you have, this is called a blue-rayed limpet, and you can see there's little sort of blue sort of stripes on it. And again, it's sort of moving around, feeding on the kelp. So it's its own little sort of ecosystem, the kelp itself, on the holdfast, on the stem, on the various sort of fronds. So yeah, fantastic piece of architecture. So you can have lots of different animals living on the seaweed. So this here is a flat winkle. So there's various types of periwinkles around, but this is a very common one. It can be yellow, brown, green in colour. So they're grazing animals that sort of crawl around. They can sort of eat the seaweeds or eat little tiny microalgae that we can't even see that are actually living on the seaweeds. So they're vegetarians, and they can be food for birds as well. Okay, so we're just on the wall of the pier here. So there's lots of interesting things attached themselves onto the wall. Obvious one here, you've got the green seaweed here at the bottom, and that's your sea lettuce. So it's very, very thin. You can nearly sort of see through it. So that's a very common green seaweed. And then we have the bladder rack sort of attached on. As regards some of the animals, so we have the limpets. So the limpets grow very well on the rocks here, and they clamp on really, really tightly. And that's to, first of all, stop them getting washed away by the waves. And also then when the tide is out, they trap the water inside and they breathe through the water that they've trapped. So it's really important for them when the tide is out to cling on. And when the tide comes in, then they can move around. So they're grazing animals. So they might go 1/2 metre away. They have like a home base here, their shell is the perfect fit for that place, and then when the tide comes in they can move around and they graze on the seaweeds. They've got really hard metal in their tongue, and they can sort of scrape the seaweed off like sandpaper. So there's lots of barnacles as well. So they're the little small white guys here, and they're permanently fixed onto the rock. So they have a really strong cement. There's more of them even a bit further down, sort of the bigger ones. And sometimes the rock can look completely white, there's so many of them. So they're fixed permanently in place. They're actually related to crabs and lobsters and shrimps. So they do have legs, but like I said, they don't actually move. So when the tide is in, they'll open out and their legs will come out and they can feed that way. So that's your limpets and then the small barnacles. So most of the animals we've been looking at have been vegetarians, but here, this is a dog whelk. So they are a snail, but these guys, so you can just sort of see him sort of tucking himself back into his shell. They have a little groove here. That's how you know the whelks, they have a little groove on the end of their shells. And these guys are predators. So they'll actually clamp themselves, say, onto something like a limpet, and they can release a chemical that softens the shell of the limpet, and then they drill a hole through the limpet. They inject like a chemical into the limpet that sort of liquefies his body, and then they can suck it out like a soup. So yeah, pretty impressive little animals, and they can feed on barnacles as well and on mussels. And again, they can be different colours. They can be sort of brown or white, and grow slightly bigger than that. Okay, so predators, whereas most of your snails are vegetarians. In the sand, you have a lot of worms live in the sand because there's a lot of sort of decaying seaweed or whatever that they feed on. And one of the interesting worms is one called the sand mason. Okay, so the stone masons built our pier behind us, and then the sand masons build this beautiful tube made of sand, and sometimes you can see bits of mussel shells that have been broken off, little bits of black inside it. So the worm himself is down deep in the sand. It can be about 30 centimeters down below us here. But when the tide comes back in the next couple of hours, the worm will sort of come up to the tip of the tube here, and they can sort of grab any floating material that's going by. Where are the lugworms? They're around here somewhere. Now here's some up here. So we won't again see the worms themselves. They're buried down into the sand, but they've eaten the sand and then they've passed this through their body. So it's the same as the earthworms in your garden will be eating the soil and taking the food out of that, and then they'll leave a pile of soil behind. These guys have left a pile of sand behind. And this can be really important food, these worms, for birds. So you get birds with big long beaks will be out here probing into the sand, these waders. So you see lots of them, say, around Westport in the mud flats, digging down and looking for these types of worms. Okay, so now we're down big rocky area, loads of humps and hollows. So these are the rock pools. This is probably everybody's favourite part of the day. There's huge amounts to see here. Every rock pool is different. So you've got obviously lots of your limpets. You can have the anemones, those little red blobs. You can have crabs, hermit crabs, which are the crabs living inside the shells. You can have prawns, small fish, blennies, sponges underneath the rocks. So there's a huge variety here. So you have to sometimes spend a few minutes looking and see what's moving inside the rock pools. So we'll have a look and see what's living inside them. Okay, so we found ourselves a nice little pool here. So we've got a good mix of seaweeds growing. This is an interesting one here. It's called coral weed, right? And when you see it's a lovely sort of pale pinky colour. And the reason it gets the name coral weed is it's really sort of hard when you feel it. It's not as silky and moist as the other seaweeds. So it takes in calcium from the water. So in the same way as the limpets make their shell from the calcium from the water, these guys put the calcium into their fronds, and it means then it's much harder to be eaten. So it's a protective thing to stop the limpets and stuff grazing on them. So coral weed, and it's very common in the rock pools. It doesn't like being out of the water, so you'll always see it in the rock pools. Okay. We also then have loads of these. So these are your edible periwinkles. So they all have that sort of white inner half here. They're a point on them, you know, compared to, there's another one of those flat periwinkles, and they're completely sort of flat on top, and they're much brighter colours like the greens and the yellows. But they are related, but just pointy for the edible, flat for the flat, okay? And then sometimes we'll try and see them later on. You actually have hermit crabs live inside these periwinkles, so we'll track some of them down for later. But these guys, the periwinkles, have what they call like a trapdoor on their body. It's called an operculum. So that means if they're being attacked or if the tide goes out, they can seal themselves shut. They can pull this sort of door, close the door after them. And when they're grazing, then they stick their head out. You see the little antennae sticking out like you have your garden snail, okay, at home, okay? So we'll put him back in. So that's the important thing. You take these animals out, that you put them back into the same rock pool that you originally found them in, okay? So we'll put him back inside there. What else have we got here? Yeah, so you have sort of the seaweed here. It's a bladder wrack, but it also has a red seaweed, like these little tufts growing on it. So this is called Polysymphona. So it's a red seaweed, and it'll attach itself onto the knotted rack and onto the bladder rack here. Sometimes it can actually weaken it and cause it to break off. So like I said, it's nearly like the mosses and lichens growing on the bark of a tree, okay? And actually, no, it's not a huge piece, but this orange, right, that is actually an animal. So that's called a sponge. So you can get green sponges and orange sponges grown onto the rocks. So they're a really sort of simple animal, and they just sort of filter the water, seawater, through their bodies, grab any food that's there and squirt it out the other end. Red seaweeds, and it's grown here on the egg rack. So it has these sort of big bladders that keep it afloat. Look, you can sort of see the amount of the red seaweed grown on top of it there. And we also have this little fella is pepper dulse. So people for cooking like to add it in. It actually has quite a sort of strong sort of flavour to it. Okay, so now we have another, remember we had an orange sponge earlier, and this is another sponge. It's a green sponge, breadcrumb sponge. And sometimes when they're green, they actually have an algae, seaweed, living inside the animal. So the seaweed is making food by photosynthesis, and then the sponge is actually absorbing water and sieving the food out of that. So really sort of simple animals. You see the little pimples nearly on them. So that's, they pull the water in one of those and squirt it out the other. So yeah, we have a beadlet anemone here, and he's completely open. He's covered by the tide, so he's open, looking for food that might sort of float by. He's got little tentacles then that can sting, and if there's very small fish, he can grab them. Okay, so we have a bucket here. These are things we collected on the beach, sort of went for a walk, stuff that was washed up on the tide, and yeah, sort of an assortment here. So you'll often see this sort of washed up. This is sort of the holdfast of the Furze bellows kelp. It nearly looks like a little sort of sea hedgehog. So if you see those, that's what they are. We found sort of two of them just sort of walking along the beach there, and then it would grow out of that. So they're amazing looking seaweeds. So we'll put them over there. Another thing you might occasionally see is the bone from a cuttlefish. So they're a relative of the octopus and the squid, and this is an internal like buoyancy that helps them float on the surface. And sometimes people put it in the cage with their canaries as well. It's good for the beaks of the birds. Another thing that we picked up nearly looks like melted plastic, but this is actually the eggs from a whelk, the common whelk, and it's just, like I said, they actually feel like a lump of plastic. And they normally should be attached onto the rock, whatever, but they've got washed in. So eggs from a common whelk. So that's a relative of the dog whelk, so one of the snails. What else have we got here? Yeah, so this, sometimes you'll see these actually in a pair. These have sort of got broken apart, but it's from a razor clam or a razor shell, and they'll bury vertically down into the sand. And they'll filter the food through their body again, like the mussels or whatever. So razor clams, okay? So in sandy areas, they'll be buried down deep, all right? What else have we got? This is just another type of mermaid's purse, and you can actually see how they used to attach themselves onto the seaweed. So wrap around the seaweed, and then that would float there while the egg is grown inside the purse here. And that's from a cat shark. Okay, so like I said, you have rays, skates, and various types of sharks use mermaids' purses. What else do we pick up? Yeah, just half of a mussel shell. So they're what they call bivalves. Generally, they're in a pair. So we have a pair, but they obviously don't match. So that's often the case. Okay, so they'll cling onto the rock and filter the water through their body. What else do we hear? Various types of those top shells, or sorry, they're the flat winkles. So like I said, you can have green and brown ones and yellow ones, and they'll feed on the seaweeds. And this is another nice sort of coloured one. It's sort of faded a bit. He's been on the beach, I say, a long time. It's one that's called a top shell, a purple top shell. So they've got nice sort of bands on them. And then they have, it's a top shell because they have the main sort of opening, but then they've got like a little pinhole here beside it as well. So they're the only type of the snails that would have that. So that's a top shell. Yeah, so yeah, plenty of things. I mean, even like I said, half an hour of collecting. So what you want to do obviously is collect the animals that have got washed up, that are dead. You don't want to be taking things alive, but there's plenty of stuff that you'll find washed up on the beach. So hours of fun trying to figure out what eats what, who is who. In a rock pool, we found 2 hermit crabs. So hermit crabs use the shells of periwinkles or dog whelks to protect themselves. So they have a very sort of soft covering. And as they get bigger, then they have to sort of swap and find bigger shells. So we just put them into the container here so you can see them better. And then once we've had a look at them, we'll put them straight back into the rock pool. So you never want to put any sea animals obviously into fresh water. Ideally, when you sort of catch them, you can just even softly, put them into a container, then maybe into a bigger bucket, look at them for a while, and then replace them. And not to use nets, because sometimes if you use a net, their legs can get sort of tangled up. So things like shrimps, prawns, crabs, it can damage them. So just use a container, or even use your hand and then put them into a bigger container. The other thing we have here in the container is just a stone here, and it has a keel worm on it. So it actually makes an outer covering, and then the worm lives inside it. So named after the keel of the ship, they're sort of long and narrow. You'll also see the same type of idea. There's another worm, and this one's growing on a seaweed. This is actually called serrated rack or saw rack. It has a very sort of sharp edge on it, and you see that about 3/4 of the way down the beach. And then it has this sort of spiral tube worm living on top of it. Another thing we just sort of saw grown on a piece of sort of kelp that was washed up. And these are the eggs, and I think it's from a banded chink shell, and they can be various sort of colours. So there's all sorts of things, like I said, growing on seaweed. So there's all these like mini little worlds attached onto the seaweed. So you can have hours of fun, I suppose, when you come down here to the rock pools. Every day you come, you'll find different things, and you can take a photo, you can go back home, look it up on the internet to try and identify it. But even just setting the kids a task, find the smallest shell, the biggest shell, the most colourful seaweed, whatever it happens to be. There's definitely hours of fun here. And you can bring your containers, look at the animals inside the plastic containers to get a better sort of close-up view. So the main thing, I suppose, you're opening windows of wonder by going to places like this. You can see, like I said, you can see the vegetarian animals, you can see the predators, you can see the symbiosis, that breadcrumb sponge that has the algae living inside its body. So all nature is at work here. You've got the crabs eating on the dead, decaying animals. So all life is here on the rocky shore. So it's out there, go, have fun, explore, get your feet wet.